Good morning, ladies. Thank you for coming, especially thank you to those of you who came on time. I have run events before. I like to start them on time, but it's hard to start without a crowd. So thank you all for coming. Whenever I speak anywhere, I call my brother in California, who's a shul rabbi, because he knows probably off the top of his head about 2,000 jokes. I, on the other hand, cannot store a single joke in my head. So I give him a call, and I say, "Hi, Mayor. I'm not calling you to chat. I'm speaking tomorrow." He goes, "Oh, yeah, you need a joke." And he gave me the following yesterday. A man went to the pound and picked up a dog. He wanted a dog. He picked up a dog, and he brought it home. And to his utter amazement, he found that the dog responded to every type of command. Here it was this discarded dog in the pound, and it responded to all kinds of commands. He said, "Sit," the dog sat. He said, "Stay," the dog stayed. He said, "Walk," the dog walked. He couldn't believe it. And he started telling all of his friends. And he had one friend who was quite the doubting Thomas. And his friend didn't believe him. He said, "I'm telling you, this dog responds to every command. Come over to my house and I'll show you." So the man comes over to his house, and he says to the dog, "Sit," the dog sits. He says, "Bark," the dog barks. Then he says, "I'm going to try a new one I never tried before." He says, "Fetch." The dog, fetch, fetch. The dog plops himself down on the couch and starts to talk. He says, "This couch is really lumpy. It's disgusting. Even in the pound, they had better couches than this. And while we're on the subject of things that are annoying, I don't like the color of the paint on your walls. You don't serve me very good food. My water bowl is never full. And frankly, I think that you play your music too loudly." The man is astounded. I mean, even this he's never heard. He's seen him do all these commands, but to talk, he said, "I don't understand. You've been doing all these commands, but I never knew you could speak. But I'm curious. I mean, you followed all the other commands perfectly. I said, 'Fetch,' and you just plopped yourself down on the couch." The dog said, "Fetch? I thought you said kvetch." Kvetch. That's what a lot of us do when we come up against a chinuch issue or challenge that we cannot understand, or when we come up against something that our children struggle with and we can't meet their needs. So we sigh and we kvetch and we wonder what we can do. Today is about solutions. Today, Baruch Hashem, we have two wonderful speakers who will enlighten us with many strategies about how to encourage our children to love learning and about how to deal with sensory processing issues when they come up. Our first speaker, we're very privileged to have Dina Rosenfeld, who is the editor-in-chief of Hachai Publications for Children, and she is also a very beloved children's book author. Some of your children's favorite books were written by her, Labels for Label and the whole Label series. She will enlighten us with some witty and entertaining and and informative strategies for inculcating a love of learning in our children. As we know that we are supposed to follow the dictate Chanoich Lanar al pi darkai, may we all be zeicha to take her words and apply them to our daily lives so that we teach our children al pi darkam. Mrs. Roosevelt.
Good morning. Once upon a time, there was a king who had no children. He was naturally distraught because there was no heir to the throne. After much thought, he came up with a strategy. He was looking for the kindest and most caring person in the kingdom to take over after him. So he devised a test. He placed a large stone in the middle of the road, the main road of the kingdom. He hid a bag of gold beneath it and hid himself behind a bush at the side of the road. He waited, and along came a regiment of soldiers. These were all very important men. They had been in the army. They served the king. And the king was so hopeful that one of them, or maybe all of them, would care enough about the public good that they would move this stone in the road that was a danger to the public. The general halted the troops, surveyed the scene, and led the men around the stone. They had no time. It wasn't their job. Next, along trooped a few very fancy ladies of the court When they saw the stone in the road, they were very distressed. There's a stone in the road. We'll have to go off the path. We're wearing our fancy shoes, our silken gowns. We might get dirty. This is disgraceful. But not a single one would dirty their hands and move that stone. The king waited some more. And along came a simple shepherd who was on his way to take care of his flocks. And when he saw the stone in the road, he stopped in amazement. The roads were usually so well cared for in the kingdom. He looked and he thought. He said, someone could get hurt on this stone. This stone in the road has got to go. He rolled up his sleeves, moved the stone, and with great effort rolled it off to the side of the road where it would not bother anyone. The king emerged. He hugged and kissed the shepherd. He gave him the bag of gold, and he said, you and you only are worthy to rule the kingdom. Very often, when I walk with my children in the streets of Brooklyn, we encounter various stones in the road. Often there are real stones. They are right on the sidewalk, where someone could turn an ankle over it, or it could get caught in the wheels of a stroller. Sometimes it's broken glass. That happens quite very often. It's right in the middle of the sidewalk. People drop things and move on. I personally am not capable of walking past any of these stones in the road. And it's not because I'm more considerate than other people. And it's not because I'm some kind of hidden tzedekis. And it's not because I want a career in sanitation. It's simply because when I was 7 years old, I heard the story of the stone in the road, and I never forgot it. When we think about ways to teach children, how can we reach them? How can we get them to love learning? I believe everything stems from the story. When I taught preschool, I have to be honest, my favorite part of the day wasn't arts and crafts. My favorite part of the day wasn't drilling them in their Kriya and their alphabets and the flashcards and the fishing games. My favorite part of the day was turning off the lights, calling the children to circle time, making sure their hands were free and empty, and starting with once upon a time. We could go on like that indefinitely. The school secretary said, I hate bringing messages to your classroom because they're always sitting quietly in the dark. What are you doing with these kids? There's something powerful about a story. And I guess the first point that we can analyze about it is the incredible capacity we have to remember stories. Today you'll be sitting here for a number of hours. You will hear information that you're interested in hearing. But I highly doubt you'll be able to come home and repeat it to your husband or your friend word for word. A story, on the other hand, well, a story that's told, you could probably convey briefly. You could give it over to someone else. But a picture book, a book you loved as a child, you may even remember parts of it exactly as they were written. I think I can. I think I can. Who doesn't remember those words? There's something about a story. Why is it like that? Well, as in most cases, when we look around the world and say, why is it like that? It's because we're looking at it backwards. It's not just an interesting and useful piece of knowledge to know that children and human beings learn best from stories. It's because the Eibishter created us that way. Human beings are basically hardwired to learn from stories. I have to admit that I don't do this anymore, but there was a brief period of time when I worked out every single day on my treadmill. To get through the boredom, I accessed stories. I turned on my radio, and I listened to one of these self-help, advice shows where you call in and everybody states their problem briefly and gets all this good advice from whoever gets to be on the radio. After I was doing this for a number of weeks, it was very interesting. I It was like an experiment I did on myself to see how long it took me to realize that a particular show was one that I'd already heard. After all, over the period of these weeks and months, I must have heard thousands of people's stories. Hi, the reason I'm calling is because, you see, my mother-in-law, whenever we go for Thanksgiving, she never makes the same kind of turkey that my husband likes, whatever the story was. Trust me, not terribly riveting stories, but stories nevertheless. And within a few seconds of the beginning of the show, I heard the caller just begin the story. I knew if it was time to turn it off because I'd already heard it, or keep listening because it was new material. I found that was also unbelievable. It wasn't just that I could remember a story from when I'm 7 years old, this one story that made such an impression on me, and also had what researchers call stickiness. The stone in the road didn't just stick with me, it actually influences my behavior as an adult. I mean, that's what we're looking for. But here, these are stories that are just going in one ear and out the other, and yet I did remember them on some level. I could tell if I'd heard it before. So the reason for all this, the reason for the power of stories and narrative, is because the Eibishter made us that way. And he set up our Chinuch from the very beginning to flow with narrative. So it's not a surprise. When I speak to school groups, I often challenge them. I say, prove to me that stories are important. Give me sources. I want sources and I want proofs. And there's usually one kid, even in a crowd of 5th or 6th graders, who will go, because the Torah starts with stories? That's exactly it. It's often asked, why? Why does the Torah include all these stories? Really, the Torah is a book of instruction. It should start with instructions. Why doesn't it start from Anechi Hashem Elokecha? Start with the 10 Commandments. But no. Not only does the Torah begin with stories, we have 2 entire books, Bereshis and Shemos, that aren't just full of stories. They're full of stories with dialogue. And so often the dialogue is repeated. First the action occurs, and then the person talks about it afterwards. They're incredibly fleshed out and beautiful stories in detail. And then we have something, a basic tenet of Yiddishkeit, like keeping kosher, for example, which is told very briefly, very succinctly, and is not complete without tons of additional information that we received from the Torah Shebal Peh. You cannot keep kosher by just reading the 5 books of Moses. It's not possible. But the story of Eliezer, looking for a wife for Yitzchak, with detail, what he said, what he prayed for, what happened, how the events unfolded, and even more. The Medrash provides even more detail. We are a people of the book. We are a people of stories. So it's obvious that stories hold the key. In many occasions, stories hold the key to learning. I ask the children also when I speak to them in schools, tell me a time when telling a story is actually a mitzvah. Pesach. Give me another one. What? Purim. We have the 3 P's actually. We've got Parsha, we've got Pesach, we've got Purim. Parsha, when we read the Parsha stories, they inspire our week. The Rebbeim said in the Daf Leben mit der Zeit, we live with these stories. And what's so amazing about them, and what puts these stories in a different category, is that these are not stories for children. To many people, stories from the Bible are what they heard in childhood, and that's where it ends. But the week in which we read about Rivka Imenu with the well, and according to the Medrash, she was 3 years old, and she did this amazing act of kindness, cannot be compared to Cinderella. It has so many more advantages. First of all, everybody's learning about 3-year-old Rivka, not just 3-year-olds. Venerable sages, Zaydas, Rebbes, are learning it the same week, at the same time, on a vastly deeper level. But they start with the same Pashat Pshat. Our stories, again, they're Halik. So Parsha, with Parsha. Pesach, we have a very interesting obligation in the story of Pesach. Pesach, and the very first thing we encounter during Magid in the Haggadah is the story that tells us it's very important to tell this story. It tells the story of the 5 leaders of the generation who sat all night long discussing Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, in detail. And I can't even imagine what kind of detail, what kind of conversation it was, and what kind of storytelling was taking place around their Seder table. These were the leaders of the generation, like the Rebbe of their time. Simple people were telling the story that night, and the Talmidei Chachamim and leaders of the generation told the story that night. And they didn't tell it quickly, and it wasn't something they just mentioned, it was something they delved into. On Pesach, we don't say specific words only. The more we expand the story, harei zeh meshubach, the better it is. Then we have Purim. Purim's the other thing. Purim's the word-for-word rendition of a story. That's your picture book. That's your beloved picture book that you're reading to your child at night, and you're really tired, and you think, you know what? This would go a lot faster if I skipped a couple of pages or a few words. Not even a whole paragraph. Something. It's late. It's really late. And they never let you get away with it, because every single word is beloved, and they know it by heart. That's Purim. On Purim, we do not fulfill our obligation of hearing the Megillah unless we hear every single word, and, al pi halacha, according to Jewish law, unless we hear every single word in order. If a person were to read it backwards and say, I heard every single word, it doesn't count. The story has to be read in order and have meaning. We need to listen carefully to each word and respond appropriately. So again, there is no doubt, if anybody is doubting that stories are important, as a tool for learning, you can't doubt anymore. This is how we're created, this is how we're made, and this is why we spend so much time on stories. So here's the next question. We all agree stories are important. They're part of our lives. This is how we live as Jews. This is how we learn as human beings. This is how we remember information. This is how we process things. When do we begin? When do we start to tell our children stories? This is particularly interesting to me because I like to know when people are buying books. How low can we go? At Achai Publishing, I thought, I took it to the lowest level. Look, board books. And not just regular board books. I wanted Achai board books to have something really special. These are playful action rhymes. These books don't just have to be read and with showing the child the page. These are action rhymes. I am a Torah. Give me a kiss. There are motions. Once you learn it by heart, you can do this anywhere. You don't even need the book. It can become part of what you do in your daily activities. But that's not where storytelling really begins. Everyone knows the story of the woman who came. It was in the days of the Talmud, and she brought her newborn infant to the rabbi and said, "When shall I begin educating my child?" She was so proud of herself. She brought this newborn baby, and she's ready to start his education from day one. But the rabbi looked back at her and said, you're 9 months too late. If you just start thinking about educating your child after he's born, what do you mean? The environment of a child before they're born also has an impact. So, I guess that's the first ingredient of developing a love of learning in children. It's what you love yourself. So you may sit there and go, oh no, I hate to read. My child is not going to love to learn. But what if you love to crochet? What if you love to do art projects? What if you love to sing? What if you love to dance? The first ingredient of learning is a love of life, an enthusiasm. There's something that you love. The question is what? In the case of Mr. Woods, what he loved was playing golf. And so, when his little boy was 18 months old, he bought him a set of golf clubs. Everybody was fascinated by this. They couldn't believe it. Because in a game that was largely dominated by older white men who were relatively affluent and lived a certain lifestyle, the person winning the trophies was this young, ethnic kid from a fairly average home. What gave him the edge, the 3 ingredients that made it work? that he had a father who loved golf. He had a father who was willing to spend time with him and transmit his passion for golf. And the kid actually had an aptitude and a love for golf himself. So all the three things were in place. He became a champion. He won the trophies. I guess the same is true when we are dealing with children, either in the classroom or in our homes. If you love the outdoors and nature, it's going to be a big part of what you do. When I moved to Brooklyn from out of town, and this is a real walking community and people see you walk, it took me a while to adjust, which means I started dressing a little bit differently when I went out for a walk, because I wasn't just like going into my backyard where no one saw me. And I started realizing that's a whole social thing to stop and you see people when you walk. You don't just walk by. Walking in Brooklyn is different. But there's one habit I've never been able to break. When I'm walking with a child in a stroller, I can't help it. If it's fall or it's spring or it's winter, we're always picking leaves and picking up stuff and schlepping home things from the outdoors. It's free. It's there. And again, it becomes part of your child's story. Look what Hashem made. Why are the leaves brown? Why are they different colors? Why does the dandelion plant have some yellow flowers and some white puffy balls? We're creating stories wherever we go. And when we bring those little things into our child's lives, it doesn't have to be expensive or fancy. Someone said to me today, "Oh, you're talking about developing a love of learning in children. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, like you do in your house, you talk to your kids in rhyme sometimes." And that's just, I'm like, you're going to make everyone feel so guilty. I bet you make flashcards for your kids and you teach them to read way before they learn in school, and you probably read them books all the time. And I'm like, nah, we pick flowers. We pick leaves. After these books, after I've edited a book and proofread it and copy edited it and laid it out and switched it around, I can't stand to look at it. I have to get other people to read my kids these books. Whatever brings joy to you and your child when you're together is what you do to develop a love of learning. If you're baking challah every week, if you like to make fancy salads or try new recipes, whatever it is can foster learning. It becomes part of your family story. A child who is miserable, a child who's not motivated, can't learn. So anything you do in your home to increase simcha and bring joy develops a love of learning in your child. Be nice to yourselves. You're already doing all the important things. And it always gets me excited, I don't know why, when current research backs up what we already know from the Torah. So, back to our mother with her newborn child. Wow. From the days of the Talmud till now, we all know that a child's learning begins before they're born. A couple years ago, this made news, headline news, when someone wrote a book about how expectant parents should be sitting around and speaking to their child this way, reciting the alphabet, telling stories. This wasn't new to us. We already know this. We're already doing it. A few years ago, all scientific and medical authorities agreed that babies basically knew nothing. They came into the world unable to see well, like little kittens. They had no sense of taste or smell, and they basically were little blobs, waiting for their parents to form them and develop them and teach them. This is not what we know from our Rebbe. The Rebbe told us everything in the child's room, not to put treif animals near the child, to put a shir malis, to have sfarim. Everything in the environment makes a difference. Bingo, lo and behold, today all the researchers agree that babies are basically little learning machines. And what's so interesting about it is that everything that's already in a normal child's environment to prime them for learning is already there. Thing one, a caregiver, a mother and a father. Children, it's been shown that newborn babies recognize their parents' voices. They did a study where they dipped cloths into they expressed milk from two mothers and dipped cloths in it and put it near a baby. every infant, not 9 out of 10, every single normal infant turned in the direction of its own mother's milk. Their sense of smell is highly, highly developed. As far as their sense of sight, a few years ago, based on research, they came out with these black and white crib toys and mobiles that you hang over to stimulate your child because they like high contrast designs. This was very, very new information, right? The human face is basically a light color with some dark spots. And guess what? Researchers found that children prefer their high contrast designs in the shape of the human face. Whatever your child and baby, student, whatever a child needs is already in the environment. It's already there. To develop a love of learning, we basically need to go with our instincts. A couple years ago, I read another article that gave me great joy. They were trying to figure out how to get children from deprived environments to do better in school, to develop language more easily. What can we do to these children? Their language levels are low. It's not working. What can we do? We tried Head Start. We tried everything. The article basically concluded with these words. What every child needs to develop language is a caregiver who basically uses the style of the classic, and I quote, chatty Jewish mother. That's what it said. I'm not making it up. Oh, classic chatty Jewish mother? We're already doing that. It means creating a narrative as you go along. Good morning, my dear Annie. Come on, I'm going to change you now. You're talking to a 3-month-old or something. But this is how language starts. It starts with jargon. What's fascinating, too, is that children in China, whose mothers do that to them, develop the ability to say certain sounds that we can't really say, certain guttural sounds that are used in the Chinese language. And our children develop all the preparation for speaking whatever language we're using. So all these things are going in, and you don't have to do anything swoopy. No flashcards, no special educational toys, things that are in your environment, things you love, things that make you happy. This is how we develop a love of learning in children. We're already doing it. But again, I recently came upon this just to back it up a little bit more, and I found it fascinating. You don't have to be a children's editor or book author to bring stories to your children. You don't need any special qualifications. And if you don't do it, your child will probably do it on their own. There was a study in the early 1980s. It was called Narratives from the Crib. Project centered on a 2-year-old girl who was the daughter of 2 college professors. And they noticed that before their daughter went to sleep at night, she spent time talking to herself. For 15 months, they put a microcassette recorder in her crib to try to figure out what is going on during this period of time. What is she doing? They had 122 transcripts at the end of the study, which psychologists and language professors were delving into. They analyzed all of this, led by a psychologist and linguist at Harvard University. What they found was this little girl, she was 32 months old by the time the study was over. Her conversations with herself were more advanced than her conversations with her parents. Her vocabulary, her grammar, her usage was significantly different when she was talking on her own. The structure of her monologues had to do with stories. She gave them a window into the mind of a very young child. This is how they learn. They process as follows. This is a direct quote from one of her little speeches before she fell asleep. Tomorrow when we wake up from bed, first me and Daddy and Mommy eat breakfast like we usually do. Usually. Then we're going to play, and then as soon as Daddy comes, my friend comes over, then we're going to play a little while. And then we're going to the car with somebody to ride to nursery school, and on and on and on. What they discovered, and they used this research later to develop a certain educational child's program called Blue's Clues. They discovered that children process everything and teach themselves to think and order their world and structure everything with stories, with narrative. Now, this is not a story you could print and illustrate and sell. That's not the important part. The important part is You are doing this all the time with your child. First, we're going to clean up your room, and then as soon as you're dressed, we're going to go outside. That's a story. That's a story. That helps order everything. That helps development. That leads to learning. So again, you can do this on your own. That's Pesach. You could just tell it. You can use different words every time. That's fine. You can buy books. And I don't know how much time I have today to talk about the books you can buy, but I will tell you this. Since children already come with a love of learning, and if they're born to a normal home and a family that has basically good instincts, they're already learning. The question is not if they're learning, but what they're learning. So at Achai Publishing, what our goal is, the aim of the company is to do this, is to give you a helping hand. So you don't have to go to Barnes & Noble and go, what should I buy? Because there's so much out there. Mothers call me all the time and say, my child loves to read. What do I give them? What should I do? It's difficult. My advice is basically read everything before you hand it to your child, if that's possible. Because it's not just that secular culture today is neutral and reading a Jewish book is better. Unfortunately, secular culture has an agenda. There's certain values and ideas that the secular culture feels are very important. Some of them are completely in sync, if I can borrow that phrase, with what we're trying to do. I think The Little Engine That Could is a lovely story, and that can be included in the life of a Jewish child if you want to. It teaches sharing and compassion and helping. But some stories, I read a book review once that astounded me. It said, this is a beautifully illustrated book for children. A child in a dream sequence gets on the back of an elephant, goes down the high street of what looks like a fantasy European town, and takes items from every store along the way. Of course, if you don't, the reviewer adds, if you feel that the idea of shoplifting is brought out here, you may not want this book, but it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, I highly recommend it. Most children's book authors try to think what children will walk away with when they write something or illustrate something. But again, it's not a given. And I have to caution you that this is true even with Jewish books. There's a pattern in Jewish books, often, and not just Jewish books, but on any religious book, where it basically shows an example of a child doing something wrong. A wise parent or teacher gives them a little lecture, and at the end of the story, they correct their behavior and they do everything right. It's a double-edged sword. For a child who doesn't have a problem with that particular midah, you're teaching them in the most powerful medium possible, like in a book like Ari and the Little White Lie, for example. You're teaching them what a lie is, and you're showing them how a child lies, and then you're showing them how a child stops lying. I'd be careful. If you actually have a child who has trouble telling the truth, children live a very kind of rich fantasy life, and a lot of things they believe are true aren't really true. My child came home one day from yeshiva and I said, what happened today in school? He said, a lion came to my school. I said, oh. When? During class or during recess? Recess. Lion came to the... I said, well, that's something that is so creative, honey. That's so nice that you imagining the lion. He said, no, it really came. He wasn't being a liar. He was just being age appropriate. And again, if you're working with children or your own children in your own house, it's a very good idea to get a book on child development just so you don't panic when things like that happen. If it's age appropriate, he's not a little liar. He's just a little 4-year-old who doesn't have a really well-developed sense of fantasy and reality. So again, how are we going to help you out? Achai is going to help you out by trying to provide Jewish books that give positive messages that are age appropriate, without too many words, with colorful illustrations. And we also try to vary the artists so that we're kind of giving you a chance to develop your child's eye. We're not going to use the same artist every time. For a whimsical story, we'll choose someone with a kind of light and happy style. For a story that's more a true story from the Gemara, for an older age child, we'll choose something more sophisticated. I brought a few books. As you can see, I came with a whole suitcase full of books, just to give you an idea of what goes into each and every story and how do we craft a Jewish book, Al Taras HaKodesh. First thing, company policy. Since in picture books, children are learning through their eyes. They're getting a visual education. It's not just about the words. Wherever there is a boy, there will be a yarmulke. Wherever there is a boy, there will be tzitzis showing. Wherever there is a doorway, there will be a mezuzah. Wherever there is a bed or a bedtime scene, there will be negelwasser neatly next to the bed. In real life, we're probably not nearly so perfect. But once, as I was preparing a book to go to the printer, I noticed a little problem. This was in Labels for Label, as a matter of fact. And I was just giving it a last glance, which I try not to do because I don't even want to see sometimes what's going to happen. I noticed on a particular page, Label was getting out his stuff to label so he wouldn't have to share it. And I noticed that Label's position was something that it's a minhag Yisrael to avoid. Label was on his knees, reaching under the bed to get his stuff. I wasn't sure if this was a problem. I mean, after all, don't you sometimes go down on your knees when you bathe children in the bathroom? We do get down on our knees when we clean for Pesach. But it's a position that, because it's a position of prayer in other religions, we try to avoid. It's a minhag. It's not an avera, by any stretch of the imagination. But I wasn't sure what to do. So I called a Rav. And he said, you got to change it. I said, it might cost money, and it might delay the book, and it might, throw the whole project off. He said, can't help it. Then you'll have 7,000 copies of an example that is not Altar Kodesh for a Jewish child. I said, it's just a minhag. He said, no. Book world has to be more perfect than everyday world. And that is what we tried to do. That's kind of our company policy. So I called the artist with great trepidation. I said, Mr. Nodell, can you, it's already finished. Can you change it? And he said, don't worry. He took an X-Acto knife and he lifted the top layer of the board he was working on, and he took a little Q-tip and he dipped it in bleach and he bleached off all the paint, and it's unbelievable, but Label is no longer on his knees. Label is crouching down to get whatever he needs without being on his knees. This is the extent to which we go to try to make sure that every book is giving only positive and correct images and examples to your child. We're all anxious to hear the next speaker, and I could go on and on about books and all the different things and all the different challenges that we have when we're putting together something. But I just want to make sure you understand. Achai tries to help you out by making sure that not only the books are good Jewish examples, but also that they're serving the needs you have with your child. I went to Barnes & Noble. We were about to do a book about going to school. So I went to Barnes & Noble and said, let me take a look at all the books that are out there. And one after the other, I looked at these books and said, you know what? I don't understand them. A lot of the books about the first day of school had to do with children raising their hand, sitting in their seat, getting used to their desk. And I'm like, we don't send children to school anymore when they're 5 or 6. We send children to school when they're 18 months old. They're in playgroup. They already know. It seemed to be a holdover from a previous generation that wasn't serving the needs of our children. I said, I don't want to just make a Jewish going to school book. I want to make the best, most useful going to school book we possibly can have. So we show children walking to school, going to school, davening in school, doing things in circle time, having a chair and a cubby, playing with toys. This is the school that you really need to prepare your child for, not the school of raising hands and looking at the blackboard and sitting at desks. The same is true when we did an ABC book with Jewish items. We made sure to choose items that started with short vowel sounds because that's how children begin to learn to read. So A wouldn't be for something like ape, with the A sound. A was for fi koimen, because is how children learn. By the same token, we did this. We had a very interesting challenge with our yarmulke book. Parents would come over and say to me, what do I do with my little one? He doesn't like to wear his yarmulke. And I'm like, I sometimes hear parents saying, oh, your yarmulke fell off, you little shagets, put it back on. I don't think that's what we want to do. I think what we want to do, again, increase joy and excitement when it comes to chinuch. So we decided to make a yarmulke book that shows a child doing millions of different activities wearing a yarmulke. Until the secretary at Hachai, who is from a different community, said, oh, we don't call it a yarmulke. I'm like, oh no, what are we going to do? What do you mean you don't call it yarmulke? Do you call it a kippah? She said, no, we call it a kappel. Kappel. What's a kappel? A kappele. Put on your kapelle, Shefela. Okay, this is not going to work. If we want to sell this book outside certain communities and into others, we're going to have to do all of it. And this is the biggest challenge in Jewish publishing today. What does the tatzi look like, or the abba, or the daddy, when he makes kiddush? He could wear a kippah sruga with no beard. He could wear a shtramel with a full beard and a bekeshe. He could have a hat with pinches, without pinches. It's unbelievable. There's actually a 613 mitzvah project card thing coming out now. The artist himself told me he's drawing 3 versions for this very reason. There's so many minhagim. What do we do? In this book, we found a solution. And this, again, it increased the value of the book's educational value, because the little yarmulke icon that appears in the book replaces the word, and a parent will say whatever word you use in your house. You'll say a couple when I giggle, and when tasting Shabbos kiggle, or you'll say a kippah, or you'll say a yarmulke. So again, in every book, and maybe we could meet again and go into each book and how it was formulated. But in each book, we try to meet both the Jewish needs, our Jewish goals, our chinuch goals, and sound educational practice at the same time. And that's why, like this, for example, is not only a terrific Jewish book to give or get as a gift, it's also the most comprehensive telling time book I've ever seen. It's not just every hour. It starts with every 5 minutes. It has little characters on top who show the relation of the large hand to the small hand, and say different ways of saying the time, like 7:45 is also 7:45. That's something you won't find in most telling time books. So again, going al Taras HaKodesh today does not mean sacrificing quality, and it definitely, I hope, will increase joy in your homes when you use and read and tell these stories and read these books. We started with these 2 to see how they would take off. And people don't expect Hachai to have board books. So they weren't our top sellers. But I think if we have more opportunities to do more, there are these 2 titles. Make sure you have both. Okay. Sure. Well, actually, we just brought out one of our best-selling titles, Is It Shabbos Yet? Again, this is probably the best first book for children because of the repetition. It's a simple story. Is it Shabbos yet? asked Malki. No, Malki said her mommy. First we have to. It's the perfect sequencing book. That when I'm talking about stories or narrative, it doesn't take a lot for a child to love it. It's predictable. It's the same. It aids memory. Try to ask your child what comes first and second in the book. If you're in a classroom, you can actually make cards of the different activities and see if they can put it in order. We did publish that in Yiddish. But since Yiddish and Hebrew involve flipping the illustrations, then you've got your mezuzahs on the wrong side. You've got people doing mitzvahs with the left hand instead of the right hand. Again, a minhag that we pay attention to. But we do have interest from shluchim, and often they contact us and say, I want to publish your book in Spanish or Portuguese. We have books in Russian. We have books wherever the language goes in the same direction, and we have interest. We'll provide them with the illustrations. They get a translator, and we collaborate on etiquetas para label. Well, I'd like to pave the way for the next speaker by reading this. By reading something that was written in, here we go again, 1898. In 1898, on Yud Ches Sivan, this time of year, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber, the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, asked his son, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, the Frierdiker Rebbe, to write a treatise on education. We are all familiar with it as this Maimer, Klalei HaChinuch VeHadracha, which as mothers and educators we have encountered more than once. I'd like to read to you just one small phrase from this groundbreaking material. The Rebbe writes, souls are all equal. The differences between people are attributable to differences in the manifestation of the faculties or the koiches of the soul, of the neshama. The author you came out to hear today focuses on those differences in ways that help children access their learning capabilities and the capabilities of their soul. All children love to learn. All children love to experience new things. What she has done in her groundbreaking books is analyze step by step children who have various needs and how to meet them. And what I'm always struck with in books of this type is that they don't just give information that's useful to parents with children or students with a particular problem or challenge. As a matter of fact, the book is dedicated to every child who wants to have fun. And I think this is the book that's going to make my summer this year. The activities here are simple and fun, and they're done with activities and objects that you have around the house. And that's the best kind of learning. Thank you so much for coming out today.
Okay, I know everybody's anxiously awaiting Carol Kranowitz, so I'm not going to take up your time except to tell you a great story, which is the kind of story that I call a gift. And those who have been my students in high school or seminary know that when I come across an experience in life and it fits right in with something, it's what Rashi calls a siman yofeh, fits right in with something that we learned or fits right in with something we've discussed, I get very excited about it, and I come into class and I tell my students, I have a gift. The gift was, yesterday, Carol and I were eating dinner. And Carol asked me to help her with a bracha before the food. And after we said our brachas, she asked me what shahakol means. And, you know, I'm a Jewish mother and I like to teach all the time, so that was my opening to start telling everything I knew about Birchais Hanen and the brachas that we say on the things that we enjoy. When it occurred to me that everything that Carol is about relates to the whole topic of Birchais Hanen. What's Birchais Hanen? The brachas that we say on things we enjoy with our senses. Things that we see, like a beautiful ocean, a mountain view, lightning. Things that we hear, thunder, smell, besamim, or beautiful plants. Things that we taste, our food. Birchais Hanenin is all about sensory integration, appreciating what the Eibishter gave us, the things that God gave us in His world, for which we use our five senses. And through using those five senses, we come to a greater appreciation of God, a greater appreciation of the beauty of His world, and the wonder of the world that He gave us. What happens when the sensory system is out of whack? Well, then we have sensory overload, or we have stimuli that we can't make sense of in our physical world. And that is why we have been very blessed to have Carol Stock Kranowitz come and address us today about how to deal with those moments, or those days, or those lifetimes where we have difficulty, or our children have difficulty with sensory processing and sensory integration. Carol, too, like Mrs. Rosenfeld, is a former preschool teacher and the author of The Out of Sync Child. The Out of Sync Child Has Fun. And without any further words, Carol Kranowitz.